Hey folks, welcome to my channel where I talk about interesting tech careers beyond software engineering and how to get them. In this second video of the 4-part series, I'm going to talk to you about the core program management interview where you're going to be tested on your program management skills, which is essentially the day-to-day of what a program manager does. So they go by different names across different companies. So Amazon calls them program management interviews, Facebook calls them program sense interviews, Google calls them role-related knowledge interviews, and so on and so forth. But the common theme remains that they're trying to test what a program manager does on a day-to-day and whether you're able to do those. So these include skills across strategy and planning and various parts of execution such as stakeholder management, execution related to tracking and coordination, communication skills, risk management, and lastly, and very importantly, working through very ambiguous situations and dealing with them. Questions will be a mix of hypotheticals as well as ones that will help the interviewer understand your past experiences as a program manager and give them evidence for how you make decisions. I want to give you a few examples of the kind of questions that you can expect, especially talking about the hypotheticals. These are going to be core program management interview questions, as I said, right? So it could be on the lines of, let's assume you have a well-drafted plan and your launch date is very near, but suddenly there's some form of rescoping. Either there's a change in requirements by the leadership, or there's some kind of change by your customers or your clients, or that some kind of teams are not able to cooperate with you in your earlier expected scope. So how do you go about making sure that the launch still happens in a well-defined timeline? So that could be one question that you could face, and this is a very important one. Another type of question that you can expect over here would be on the lines of understanding and working with different stakeholder groups and being able to prioritize different requests. So it could be on the lines of, okay, let's assume you have this particular program and now suddenly you have 4 different stakeholder groups with each with very competing requests. How do you go about prioritizing which ones to take care of, and how do you make sure that the program still lands and launches? Talking about the past interview questions, there could be ones which are trying to understand how you've taken critical decisions in the past and how you've navigated through very ambiguous situations. So it could be on the lines of, tell me about a time when one of your programs didn't go well. What did you learn from it, and how would you take the learnings from this particular program that allegedly didn't go well to make sure your future programs like that are successful? So broadly, they're trying to understand over here on how you make these decisions and what kind of factors do you account for when you're making these decisions across the 4 broad themes that we spoke about, right, in the first video. So do check that out. In the last video, we spoke about case-based interviews, which are going to be testing your problem-solving skills, and where I walked you through key tips. So please check that out if you already haven't. But what I'm going to be doing differently for this video is we're going to take one specific question and we're going to talk about key tips to take on those, and I'm going to give you ideal answer or what I would give in one of those interviews, and hope that helps you kind of think through how to address such kind of interview questions for your core program management skill based ones. So let's assume that the question is that there's a program for which you already have a draft plan, and now the leadership has communicated that there should be a particular scope change. How do you go about ensuring that the program still launches in a reasonable timeline? Number 1, assess the situation and identify the key goals of the program. So my first thought is going to be to understand the situation a bit more deeply. So my first stage would be to identify from the leadership on why these scope changes are coming along at this stage in the program launch, right? So I'm going to try to understand this and try to also map this to the old scope of the program that we had and make some kind of comparisons on what those deltas are and communicate that with the leadership that here are these new changes that I'm understanding of what you are telling our product team to do. I'll also try to paint a picture of what the similarities are, because sometimes it's very important to communicate upwards in a very sensitive manner. So rather than trying to point out, oh, we agreed upon this scope in the past and hence I'm not going to change it, rather to understand that here are these similarities, and if you think it's still okay to proceed, we can do that, and it still tries to address the key goals that you're telling us through this scope change. But if that's still not the case, I'm going to ask the lead to give me a little bit of time to reevaluate the situation and come back to them with options across 3 broad categories, and I'm going to do that in coordination with our stakeholder groups. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell them, 1, what happens if we stick to the old scope, and what are the risks and what are the kind of trade-offs that you are making by sticking to the old situation. Second is, if we have to meet this new scope that they're providing us, what are the different things that we need from them, be it engineering bandwidth, research bandwidth, product bandwidth, or some kind of like budgets, or some kind of like changes in timelines and so on and so forth. The third is going to be for me to try to think of an alternate path, or a path that helps us meet that new scope in a meaningful way, but not still completely do it in the same way that it's been prescribed, but it still meets those key goals, and give them a rationale for why this kind of like midway scope helps cover some of these goals that they were talking about as well. Stage 2 would be to bring in more stakeholders. Now, it's a very critical part of a program manager to bring in more people together in the collective decision-making process, because as I mentioned in the first video, that you're not the owner of everything. You are actually influencing without authority. So my next step would be to work with product and engineering teams, for example, and try to figure out one, what is their availability, and second, what is the threshold, right, to understand and also accept these new changes that the ones that the leadership is proposing. And once I have a better picture of that in mind, I'm going to be working with my cross-functional partners such as like legal, marketing, so as to understand what are the kind of delays it causes in the launch plan that they have in the parts that they are owning. With that in mind, we'll have a much better understanding of how this new particular scope affects different people in the circle, and also what are their availabilities and thresholds to accept this new change. And once you have a sense of that, you go back to the drawing board and try to figure out on what part of the scope can we agree upon, and whether if it's the full scope, do you think that the teams have the right availability and the right thresholds and the understanding of that scope to be able to execute on that. Step 3, lay out your execution strategy. Now that you have a better understanding of one, what the scope from the leadership is, and two, what are the thresholds and availabilities of your own product engineering and cross-functional teams are, what you do is go back to the drawing board and come up with an execution plan that kind of tries to meet some of these factors together, right? And you're going to present your stakeholder groups with a few key scenarios which you think are going to be important. So that's exactly what I do. I'll present them with a few key scenarios that, look, here is this new scope change and here is what it means for you, because it's very critical that our stakeholder groups know what it directly means for them rather than them having to figure out the entire plan by themselves, right? So as a program manager, I'll try to do that and distill those key insights across different product groups, engineering groups, research teams, as well as our cross-functional partners, to make sure each of them have a clear understanding of what they would be doing while they are going to be working on this new and revised scope, and how it affects, one, their availability of resourcing, for example, engineering bandwidth, research bandwidth, product bandwidth, and so on and so forth. And secondly, how it affects timelines on their side, right? And at the same time, I take it on myself to work with these teams very, very closely to figure out what is that they need to be able to meet it within the timeline that we are kind of going after. And mind you, it would be a slightly aggressive timeline because we are rescoping, but we're still trying to land in the same one. So for that, what you could do is work, for example, if you're working with my engineering team, you could be making sure that they have the right set of people available to do this with the right set of skill sets. And if they don't, how can we work with, say, other teams within engineering who might have such kind of skill sets and who can ramp up quickly, right? So asking for other teams to be able to do this, and there's going to be a lot of negotiations and influencing that would happen to make sure that it is possible as well, right? And if that's not possible, is there some kind of things that I can do to make sure that the process can parallelize a bit in terms of development milestones, and how can we make sure that things happen in parallel instead of having to do at the same time, right? So coming up with these kind of different strategies with the execution plan as a program manager will be very, very critical. And once we have done that, and once we have a better idea of what is the kind of bandwidth that's available from the team, what are the timelines that we're going after, it's very important that, especially in a situation where we have a revised scope, that everybody knows what they're doing, right? So having, like, say, a clear RACI chart, which is a responsibility, accountability, consulted, and informed matrix, right, across who needs to know what to kind of make this new scope happen. At the same time, having very, very clear project charters, project timelines for everyone, which the program manager will create to make sure that everybody's on the same page, and that these artifacts are largely visible to the team, and each person in the team has an understanding of what they need to do to meet this new scope. Number 4, communicate. We've spoken about this time and again that communication is very critical to what a program manager does. So my next step would be to make sure that all the stakeholders, including the leadership, are very well informed of what level of progress is happening across each of these different streams, and whether we are still on track to kind of deliver on the launch that we had agreed upon with a new kind of scope. Given that we are working with a new and revised scope in a limited time frame, it's very important that everybody in the group has the agency to be able to report up their key blockers, key ways in which they could get help from either the program manager or other cross-functional teams, and so as to have shared artifacts that can help enable this. So I'd make sure that communication kind of solves for these things, and there are artifacts that kind of back up this with, say, a written communication. Step 5, launch and measure. Now that we know that we have everything that we might need, there are all the teams aligned, all the stakeholders are aligned, you've communicated well, you have a revamp plan, it's now our job to kind of make sure that everything that's needed for the launch kind of happens, right? So making sure that we've taken a risk assessment strategy in place very, very clearly, which kind of outlines what happens if we are meeting this revised scope in this particular new timeline, and making sure we have everything that we need to kind of meet that. It's also very important that we know that we're not forecasting any further risks, and that we've taken in account various factors across different cross-functional teams, be it legal, privacy, compliance and so on and so forth, to make sure that there are no failure modalities for this program in a way that it can still be successful and meaningful. As we prepare for the launch, it's very important to get the right buy-ins and approvals from the right set of stakeholders while we are preparing for this launch. So it's very important for the program manager to be able to do that. And lastly, as we figure out the launch, it's very important for us as a program manager to set up ways to constantly measure the success or the failure nodes of the program in ways that make sense, be it analytics, be it qualitative feedback, be it quantitative feedback, or some kind of like product metrics and so on and so forth. And very critically, it's important, as we've gone through all of these 5 stages, to work with your team after the launch to make sure that once we have this rescoping exercise done, we are able to prepare for such kind of rescopes better whenever they happen in the future, in a way that we do some kind of like post-analysis about this entire situation and make sure that we are able to be successful whenever we have to face such a situation all over again. So those are all my tips for you for dealing with the program manager skills interview. If you have any thoughts or anything that you'd like to know more about, please comment below and I'm happy to address those questions. And meanwhile, if that was helpful, please like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.